$96 billion was paid into the tax system by undocumented immigrants in 2022.
And how much money are they taking from the government in benefits?
They're not getting it back.
They entered the country illegally and they should be kicked out, and all their children and all of them should be kicked out if they entered illegally. If they do not belong here, they should be sent back.
Well, look, when I look at what my parents did when they came to this country 40 years ago, they've been through a bit of hardship. They didn't come to this country with very much money. So they taught me in my childhood was that hardship isn't the same thing as victimhood, and that stuck with me and served me well ever since.
The way you just described your parents, that describes the original colonists that came over and left England
Totally.
to a place that had, it was wild land that they came to over here.
Whoa. Bro, you're not telling them the whole story. You see, this is where Vivek's family is historically from. His family's ancestral home was here, in this Malayalam and Tamil-speaking agraharam in Kerala, Palakkad. To the average American, this might not mean much, so allow me to illustrate. An agraharam is an ethnically segregated settlement exclusive for Brahmins, with the main temple of the town nearby. Other families considered lower are not allowed to even cast their shadows on the grounds inside many of these settlements. And for the longest time, many were not even allowed to enter the temples. It was generations of struggle by marginalized caste folks that even allowed them the access to enter the temples. Usually attached to agraharams in Kerala, outside the settlement were rice paddies. This is where your rice grows. And who works these fields? Marginalized caste folks who slaved away to give most of their produce and earnings to the temple at the center as taxes. That same temple built by marginalized caste folks. The temple was usually owned by a committee of Brahmin men from the agraharam itself. They would enrich themselves through the proceeds of the temple and then trickle down some of those resources to the middle manager castes, the overseers and supervisors. They would give them titles and so on, and pat them on the back, while the people at the bottom would get maybe 2 pieces of cloth. This was the gist of a temple-centric society. It used bonded labor for some intermediary castes and chattel slavery for other castes further down the chain, all to maintain a permanent underclass. The workers did not own the mud huts they lived in or the land that they tilled, while the Brahmin children of the agraharams were able to become landlords, business owners, scholars, advisors to kings, and later advisors to the British during the British Raj, when many folks were able to go to England and receive education. This is the real legacy of Vivek Ramaswamy. And it's these systems of resource management, control, and segregation for the maintenance of a permanent underclass that we talk about when we mention caste. Vivek Ramaswamy has no problem bad-mouthing black folks in the US and being complicit in the maintenance of white supremacy because his family tradition is rooted in similar systems, justified and fortified by Brahminical reasoning and biological determinism. The oppression of marginalized castes exists for one thing: capital gain. I illustrate this because it is one of the core misunderstandings people have when trying to understand how a Vivek Ramaswamy or a Kashyap Patel can exist, and why they get along so well with other beneficiaries of cruel systems like apartheid. These agraharams haven't gone away, by the way. They're still around, and many mansions still have bonded laborers attached to them. The Dalit or indigenous laborer is usually made to live in a shack at a calculated distance away from the mansion. And tall trees, usually coconut trees, are planted between the mansion and the shack so the head of the house doesn't have to look upon the shack. For fear of spiritual pollution. It is this caste privilege that allowed Vivek's family to attain higher forms of education well before a Dalit child was even allowed to enter a school. If the Dalits are at school, who's gonna work the fields for no pay? Now, of course, this goes without saying, not everyone from a privileged caste is like this, but this history of benefiting from oppression like this is what makes Vivek's situation so much worse. Because to put it bluntly, some folks just don't want to share space in an office or a dining table with children of people who have historically been their slaves at worst, or society's manual scavengers, laborers, fishermen, leatherworkers, and craftsmen. Odd, because we wouldn't have this culture that we're also proud of if it weren't for those workers. They'd rather be around other Indians of respectable status and positions. Doctors, lawyers, children of business tycoons and actors who claim to have warrior ancestry, the creme de la creme of society. Caste and neoliberal capitalism is a match made in hell. Caste is inextricably tied to politics in India. It was not long ago that the Bharatiya Janata Party was jokingly known as the Bharatiya Patel Party in Gujarat, owing to the fact that most of the first BJP MLAs and MPs from Gujarat were Patels. The Patels or Patidar community had been land tillers working under Kshatriya landlords in the past. However, after Indira Gandhi's decision to convert land tillers into landowners in Gujarat, the community became predominantly a landlord community. Skyrocketing land prices in Gujarat had made the community quite rich in the 80s, and prominent families sought to enter the political sphere and expand the reach of their businesses. Keshubai Patel, Praveen Togadia, and A.K. Patel were big names who attracted big numbers to the BJP. Many may not even know that caste is not even just an Indian thing. This is because caste is not really understood by most people the way white supremacy is. Folks in America can understand easily how white supremacy is tied to capitalism, but many are still incapable of viewing the caste system in India through that same lens, even though both function the same way. Instead, they view it kind of like a disease that every Indian, no matter what their caste is, carries with them abroad like a monolithic hive mind, and it flattens everyone's experiences regardless of class as well. Let me give you two more examples to give you a bit more of a global perspective on what caste really is. French folks watching this, you might know of your fellow countrymen, the Cagots. The folks who look exactly like other Frenchmen, who are indistinguishable from other white Europeans. They looked French, talked French, and prayed like the French. So the way French societies would discriminate against them was to meticulously record ancestry. They would use this to determine a class of pure-blood French and separate them from the Cagots. Discrimination against Cagots took many forms, but just like the Osu of Nigeria and Dalits of India, or the Burakumin of Japan, Cagots were made to live away from the rest of the French and forced to only take up certain manual labor jobs. In their case, it was mostly carpentry and construction. Pure-blooded French were not allowed to even touch them, and vice versa. In fact, the Cagots were also exempt from tax collection later on because the tax collectors didn't want to touch the coins that the Cagots touched. Also, they were paid next to nothing anyway, so there wasn't much to collect. In French churches, you will find these small, beastly heads constructed to designate where the Cagots were supposed to sit at the back of the church. Migrants who are essential to the upkeep of the US, its construction industry, essential to its food and agricultural systems, are being blatantly exploited. Many don't have contracts and are not paid wages. And when they ask about their wages, the law is used against them. They are branded illegal even as they are waiting for documentation, and then they are dragged out of the country by ICE as privileged Americans cheer with joy. It's like a sick ritual.
Immediately upon taking the oath of office, I will launch the largest deportation program in American history.
Murderers, rapists. So when I was there, I was able to watch one of the flights landing and them unload about 15 different of these criminals. Those were mainly child pedophiles, those that were out there trafficking children, trafficking drugs.
What percentage of your workers are not U.S. born?
Probably half.
Worried if there were a mass roundup of undocumented migrants that you might lose workers, you might not have enough workers.
How are they going to do that? Nobody will be filling the shelves, nobody will be producing food. Within 2 days, we will not have food.
Does Governor Noam understand that? Christy Noam of South Dakota, her farm is just a few miles away.
These factories and corporations and billionaires benefit by the average American not seeing this as a problem. Documentation in America is slow and difficult on purpose, because how else will these industries have a permanent underclass to exploit? Even in this case, you have a curious caste-like division, where privileged folks of minority backgrounds as well who voted for Trump were willing to throw people out who look just like them because they identify with the power and authority that white men wield in America. The backlash and collective punishment the entire Latino community is receiving right now, regardless of what their personal opinions are, from other marginalized folks is exactly what the white boys on top want you to do. The indifference some Americans who claim to be on the left are showing to brown folks being deported while saying that they voted for them is indicative of a caste-like system of collective punishment for an entire bloodline. This is ridiculous and unhelpful, considering the fact that undocumented folks can't even vote. Empathy is dead. All these systems across the world exist for a capitalist society to create a permanent underclass and exploit them. I want you to nail this idea into your head as you watch the rest of the video. Asian Americans had once been demonized by the US government, even called an unassimilable race, with South Asians specifically being called the least desirable race for immigration to the US. But during the 1960s, they were transformed into the model minority, a cudgel to be held by white supremacist governments to lecture and beat down black civil rights movements who were fighting for the same civil rights that South Asian folks moving to the US would come to benefit from. Unfortunately, when your government wants to only import the most privileged creme de la creme folks who benefited from caste privilege, this creates a huge political imbalance. At a time when civil rights movements were still active in India, with the likes of the Dalit Panthers in the 70s or even the Asian youth movement in the UK, who literally identified as black around the same time, something different happened in the US. Privileged conservatives like Vivek Ramaswamy took for granted the civil rights that were won for them by black power movements. This naturally leads to resentment among minorities and deflects from the white supremacist immigration system that caused this problem in the first place. And rather tragically, also creates a situation where other minorities from South Asia have to take the brunt of the heat for the actions of privileged folks like Vivek Ramaswamy. You know that tweet he made about his apparently superior culture of hard work and blah blah blah? This self-aggrandizing lecture and how he painted all Americans as lazy and not disciplined and so on. That's exactly how privileged caste folks have been talking about marginalized castes in India for generations. So now you have intercommunity conflict. The mere existence of more Indian minorities now in the West shakes the foundation for what it even means to be an Indian in relation to white supremacy. Groups who have historically lynched, hung, and beat up Christians, Muslims, Sikhs, Dalits, and Adivasis in India are putting Trump's foot in their mouths. Why are prominent Indian Americans aligning themselves with the apartheid state of Israel? Why does Hindutva rhetoric sound eerily similar to Zionist propaganda? By 1965, India had only been an independent nation for around 18 years. 18 years was not long enough for a country as diverse and vast as India to break the social shackles imposed by both colonialism, for which you do not need a definition, probably, and homegrown feudal systems like caste. 18 years was not long enough to ensure that Dalit folks are not cleaning human waste with their hands at the beck and call of privileged caste folks who run the schools, the hospitals, universities. It certainly hasn't been dismantled after 75 years. It was not long enough to dismantle the systems that kept Adivasi tribal folks running from privileged caste landlords who sold their ancestral lands to the government, who sold it then to big corporations owned by privileged caste folks like Adani. The staff of most prominent Indian universities that supply educated brains to NASA or Google and so on in America are privileged caste. This is an indisputable fact.
These are elite engineering colleges whose student bodies, until quite recently, were predominantly upper caste in composition. As with many elite Indian institutions, they were both exclusive and exclusionary. And despite being public institutions funded at far higher levels than other engineering colleges, they were far from representative of Indian society. What is more, their exclusionary character has been justified through recourse to notions of meritocracy. When reserved quotas for underrepresented caste groups have been extended to the IITs, they have been met with fierce opposition in the name of protecting merit. Before the rise of lower caste rights politics, both public higher education and professional employment were dominated by upper castes. And this was not just a post-independence phenomenon. Upper castes were massively overrepresented in higher education and the professions from the colonial period. When quotas were implemented, lower caste and Dalit students who entered institutions like the IITs were stigmatized and scapegoated as less deserving, less intelligent, and less capable. The fear of exposure and the stigma and exclusion that invariably follows has forced Dalit students to try and pass as non-Dalits. When they refuse, sustained scapegoating has sometimes led to tragic suicides, as happened with Rohit Vemula at the University of Hyderabad. What is particularly perverse is that the very upper castes who try to expose the identities of those they suspect of being lower caste are also convinced of their own castelessness. Indeed, they firmly believe that it is lower castes who bring caste into institutions like theirs where it previously didn't exist. For IITians, the fact of being engineers contributes to this mythology of the casteless upper caste self. Most upper caste engineers believe that their academic and professional successes are due entirely to their own innate abilities and have nothing to do with being long-standing beneficiaries of caste and of the state. Even when they acknowledge forms of caste affiliation, they deny caste as a structural advantage. By contrast, they accuse lower caste students who have overcome severe social obstacles to attend institutions like the IITs of being the illegitimate beneficiaries of caste. The college admissions categories of the general and the reserved only reinforce this perception that caste is only present on one side of the equation.
To put it bluntly once more, they are the gatekeepers who prop up the children of other privileged caste families, while filtering out marginalized caste kids who they think are inherently unworthy or deserving of higher education, purely due to their birth to a marginalized caste family. Faculty in top universities in India also tend to turn a blind eye to harassment and bullying, which often leads to the suicide of many marginalized caste kids in India. This is intentionally done to ensure that the right kind of Indian, according to them, gets positions in government or gets to go work in the US, where of course those privileged caste CEOs will work hand in hand with other Americans and millionaires and billionaires to aid in the exploitation of other human beings, and not just Indians, other black folks and minorities as well. And it is a big misunderstanding that caste is something that only affects Indian folks, because at its heart, again, caste is inherently anti-worker. The story of South Asians in America doesn't really start in 1965 though. It started in the 1800s, and it's important to shine a light on this part of American history. You won't hear about this from Hindu nationalist organizations either, because the first Indians to make it to the US were fleeing caste apartheid and British colonialism. They were predominantly Sikhs, Muslims, Dalits, and Adivasi. The definition of the word Hindu was also different at this time. It was not a religion. It was an exclusionary racial term, and I'm not gonna rehash that again. I've done so in 2 of my previous videos. Go watch those after this if you'd like. But anyway, privileged caste folks didn't want to make the move to the US at this time because of the curse of Kala Pani, the belief that you would lose your high caste status if you were to travel across the ocean. Privileged caste folks believed that the ocean was the resting place of the gods, and to travel across them would disturb them. Many of these early South Asians in the US worked manual labor jobs in places like Bellingham in Washington and parts of California. This was during a time when the country was trying to define who gets to be an American citizen. Naturally, being the white supremacist settler state that it is, citizenship was initially granted to free white folks. The category of Asian was added much later, starting with the Chinese in 1870, Japanese in 1890, and much later, Koreans, Filipino, and Indian folk were added to the category of other. South Asians actually played a huge role in the creation of the blanket category of Asian, all thanks to white workers in California wanting to get rid of all Orientals, because apparently they were taking all the jobs in the 1800s too. Things have not changed. Americans adopted the exclusionary racial term of Hindu, the exonym codified by the British, to refer to all Indians regardless of religion. In 1982, the US started with the Chinese Exclusion Act. And then as the racists did more research, they found out that those brown folks who didn't look exactly black or white or Chinese also came from Asia. So in 1907, they renamed it to the Asian Exclusion Act to include all Indians. By this time, immigrants from the Indian subcontinent were viewed as a bigger threat than other Asian groups thanks to their active anti-colonial actions in India, which threatened the wealth of the British Empire. Not to mention the eventual formation of anti-colonial groups like the Ghadar Party in the US, led by Dalit leader Manguram Mugovalia. This was a group that sought to overthrow the British Raj by any means necessary. In 1907, race riots directed against Indian immigrants by white workers spread across the North American West Coast. The first took place in Bellingham, Washington, followed by others in Seattle, Everett, Vancouver, and parts of California. In 1910, a Senate commission declared Indians the least desirable race. The modern-day commonly held sentiment of low desirability for Indians stems from events like this. The British helped the US craft exclusionary policies directed at British Indian subjects who lived in the US. A series of congressional hearings on quote-unquote Hindu immigration, because of course they included all religions, were held in 1914, and Denver S. Church, a congressman from California, suggested a bill defining Asia based on geography rather than race to encapsulate all the different ethnicities. This is how they came up with the Asiatic Barred Zone, a zone defined by longitudinal and latitudinal coordinates preventing labor from India from entering the US. This heavily stymied the flow of immigrants from India while making travel for white British colonies much easier. Many Indians still tried to move though. Many folks crossed a literal ocean to get away from caste apartheid, and many did it by seeking employment on ships. Once they got to the US, many folks would report their race as black or Hispanic. Vivek Bald has written an interesting book on this called Bengalis in Harlem. I suggest you check that out. So basically, South Asians technically didn't exist in the US, even though they did. Many folks just assimilated into other communities. After this long gap in restrictive immigration and the US economy getting to a point where capitalists needed to bring in lower wage workers and brainpower with less pesky rights to fill their ranks. In doing so, of course, they knew they would be effing over the American workers in the name of profit, but they weren't going to let that stop them from attaining higher margins. The civil rights movement was also in full force. Black folks were fighting for basic human rights. The brutal murder of 14-year-old Emmett Till in 1955, the subsequent acquittal of his murderers by a jury comprised of white men, the decades after this would be bloody, and America saw the emergence of black leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, Malcolm X, and many more. The incremental, hard-fought wins of the civil rights movement is what won the Voting Rights Act of 1965, without which non-white folks in the US would not have voting rights. Now, the 15th Amendment of 1870 technically removed the racial barrier to vote, but of course, states continued to discriminate anyway. And before that, only white men above the age of 21 who also owned property had the right to vote. Anyway, after just 2 months of the Voting Rights Act being passed in 1965, the Immigration and Naturalization Act was also passed. The efforts of black folks won the act that allowed Vivek and Apurva Ramaswamy's parents to immigrate to the US. And his parents had that privilege early on only because of benefiting from caste apartheid, and not this mythical idea of merit and hard work. This dude wouldn't have been able to even try to run for president if it weren't for black folks. But being the cynical little opportunist he realized that to win in America, you need to get on the good side of white supremacy. You need to rub the feet of power and rub it good. Maybe put a toe in your mouth. And how do you lick the boot better than by shitting on black folks on behalf of white supremacy? It's like a prerequisite.
The clock's run out, time's up, overplow, snap back to reality, oh, there goes gravity.
Eminem has asked Republican presidential candidate Vivek Ramaswamy to stop using his music at his campaign event.
This is Sagar Jetty, another privileged Brahmin boy who has a lot to say about black folks.
As I literally said, I don't like Ta-Nehisi Coates. I genuinely I think he might be the godfather of a lot of the race problems that we have today. That's not an exaggeration in terms of that essay, The Case for Reparations, single-handedly radicalized every white girl on a college campus who eventually ended up working at the New York Times, behest of the BLM movement, of all this other nonsense that we have today. So I really do find him a villain in American politics. There are two people who I so deeply respect for their political bets: Peter Thiel and Donald Trump.
And is super buddy with all these podcast bros and a huge fan of JD Vance and also a friend, who is the blood boy of South African apartheid billionaire Peter Thiel. Speaking of which, this dude takes a lot of bullets for South African apartheid bros.
That looks like a Nazi salute. You don't think so?
Okay. If every time someone raises their hand like that, is it a Nazi salute? I believe that Elon Musk is a literal Nazi who is intentionally Sieg Heiling. Or do we have a high-functioning autistic weirdo who, if you watch the full video, is spastically dancing like this on stage and unable to control all of his movements, and also did some weird, like, my heart is with you type gesture? Which of those two things do you think is more accurate?
Backs the AfD in Germany.
Okay, AfD's not Nazis, a legitimate. So are you saying that all the people who voted for AfD are Nazis in Germany? Like,
I'm just saying, Sagar, in terms of plausible deniability, that is the most reactionary party in Germany. Part of it, a wing of it, is actually banned because of their extremism tied to neo-Nazi movements.
That's also because they have insane laws on the books.
So when
I get a bunch of shithead leftists who are constantly bitching about race or whatever, because that's what makes me mad. Or trans bullshit.
And this is what he had to say when people began pointing out Muskrat's links to apartheid. What happened to Sagar's populism? Whose side are you on? The billionaires or the American workers? America, do not let this dude get into office. It's clear which side of the aisle he's running for, and I'm not talking about left or right, I'm talking about up and down. The boot is too good for him. He cannot resist the boot. A majority of Indian Americans voted for the Democrats in 2024, with more women favoring Harris and almost half of Indian men losing their marbles and voting for Trump, just like all other male groups in the country except black folks. Now, voting for Trump is already bad, but to be honest, Indian American special interest groups, especially Hindu nationalist ones, have been doing shady stuff even when they were aligned with Democrats. And we must take a note of these groups. You see, if the world is to avoid another APAC, ADL situation when it pertains to the US's collaboration with nations like Israel, we need to be paying attention to other ethno-nationalist special interest groups seeking to legitimize themselves in the heart of empire. We need to be looking at organizations like the HAF, the Hindu American Foundation, the VHP America, and we need to take seriously the 100-odd RSS chuckers sprinkled throughout the US. We need to make clear to all Americans that these organizations are just brown KKK, who have just adopted liberal progressive language to speak to Dems, and when speaking to Republicans, they use a completely different language, one of one God. Everyone has a purpose.
Our faith tradition, Jesus Christ is a Son of God. I know that is different than saying he's the Son of God, but that is my view of Jesus Christ. He's got our family. Do we worship in churches? Yes, we do. Is that compatible with our faith? Yes, it is. One true God in many forms. So that's different, and I understand that.
That is different. The only way to heaven is through Jesus Christ.
What do people say gives them, like, oh, I can't vote for him because what are the things that they tell me?
I couldn't remember who said that to me, but they mentioned it's dark skin, and they think Muslims right away. And so I kind of set them straight on that, whether they believe I thought I was covering for him. I don't know, but and I tried to explain.
Fair, not much we can do about that one.
Well,
In a lot of ways, I think for a lot of people for whom religion is important, and we care a lot about God and our relationship to God. So I understand when people hear that we're Hindu, you want to know, like, what does that mean? Who are you? What do you stand for? So our religion teaches us that all of us have been put here by God for a purpose. And everyone has been given a gift, some gifts by God, and it's our job to use those gifts to the best of our abilities while we are here on this earth.
Just like organizations like the ADL, Jews on Campus, and other Israeli lobby groups, these groups will weaponize any criticism of Hindu nationalism and their organizations as anti-Hindu, Hindu phobia, or they'll just call you racist. You will definitely see that in this video's comment section as well. They will hide behind victimhood while oppressing other Indians in India and in the United States. Many of them might even have marched in Black Lives Matter rallies and have changed their bios saying Black Lives Matter, but they'll still throw money at Democrats in order to block any anti-caste action or legislation. That last part actually happened. And the comparison between Hindutva and Zionist groups are not unfounded. They literally share notes. The Hindutva movement in America learned from Zionists that it is advantageous for them to claim to represent all Indians. And if you follow the money, you will know that Indian Americans in the US who are aligned with these Hindu nationalist organizations funnel money back home to fund domestic terror groups like the RSS, the VHP, the Bajrang Dal. To grossly simplify it for you, rich Tesla driving uncle from San Francisco sends money to cow protection gangs in India, who then lynch poor Indians who might be Muslim, Dalit, or Adivasi, or Christian, who by the way might be raising cows because that's literally the only job that the society around them allows them to do, which keeps people marginalized and in a state of perpetual poverty, preventing them from attaining anything in their village or town because of caste-based segregation. And when some of the kids of those marginalized caste folks fight tooth and nail to get educated and then escape that casteist reality, they cannot get a job at Tesla driver uncle's company. Because Tesla driver uncle says, oh, you didn't get here by merit. You were a DEI hire. I hope this simplification helps you understand what's really going on here. A lot of Indian Americans would prefer that we don't mention this or talk about this reality. But the same people also want to laugh as indigenous minorities from another country who definitely was not assisted by caste-based apartheid. Newsflash, there are already indigenous folks in India with their own non-Hindu animist religions as well. You guys ain't it. Here is a privileged caste Hindu nationalist, local politician, literally pissing on an indigenous man because he can. Not to mention, there was a time not so long ago when the same privileged caste Hindus today disavowed and distanced themselves from even the name Hindu. They instead wanted to be called Aryas to establish a distance between them and the lowborns. Hindu nationalists, like other fascist movements, do not really have any consistent ideology. They are opportunistic and will get in bed with any lever of power just so they can advance their own ethno-nationalist agenda. Don't believe me? Allow me to provide an example. In India, Hindu nationalists' favorite enemies are Muslims, Christians, Dalits, Adivasis. But in the US, they love Christians. I mean, just look at the HAF's homepage, or even how Vivek Ramaswamy deep-throats white Christian nationalist boots to grasp at power he'll never have. Kash Patel wrote a children's book with Trump as his white king, and he gets to act like his right-hand man and bag holder? I mean, this is straight up British colonialism era brown bootlicking. Now that uncle might just become the uncle of the FBI. The British saw the Brahminical Jati Varna system or caste system in India as beneficial to aid in their project of capital extraction. Brahmin and Kshatriya rulers had already enslaved large swaths of the Indian population. There was already a permanent underclass working the paddy fields, working in morgues, literally making oil and copper and doing all the other essential things that make society run, that were conveniently also spiritually polluting according to Brahmanism. How convenient to designate all hard labor and essential work as impure so you don't have to do it. So who best to shine your boot and also help you apply it to the necks of your own people? The ones who were already doing the oppressing, of course. Administrative roles in the British Raj were overwhelmingly held by privileged caste Indian folks, and this continued well after Indian independence. Marginalized caste folks were continued to be kept out of education through violence and social ostracization. In return for administering the rest of the Indians for the British, privileged caste communities would receive monetary benefits like inam or tax-free lands. Inams and similar social subsidies used to be given to communities like the trans community in places like Maharashtra by rulers who wanted to subsidize living. So instead, the British took away social safety nets for the rest of society, but continued to allow Brahmins to live rent-free in their own agraharams. They allowed the apartheid to continue because it benefited them. This treatment continued in education in 1817. English medium education, which was necessary to hold any post in the colonial government or institution, was introduced for Brahmin children in what is now known as Presidency College. It wouldn't be for another 100 years that marginalized caste folks would be able to access English education. This was mutually beneficial for the colonizers and the privileged castes, because privileged caste folks could play the role of the perfect middle manager. The entire role of Brahmanism is to impose untouchability. Untouchability is a byproduct of trying to create a permanent laborer class, where the laborers' children as well will forever be laborers. Like in the case of anti-miscegenation laws in the US as well, this directly affects women's bodies and choice, because women's bodies become the vessel to continue white supremacy, or in the case of India, Brahminical supremacy. Without untouchability or the rules around maintaining untouchability, Brahmanism would not exist. This is why the privileged caste folks were perfect for the British to use against the native population. What about in the Middle East? You might be wondering that there's no way Hindu nationalists are getting along with other Muslims, right, in the world, given how Muslims are treated in India. This is the new temple in Abu Dhabi, inaugurated by literal royalty, covered by a lot of Hindu nationalist accounts as well. When thousands upon thousands of South Asians died in building that stadium for the World Cup, did Hindu nationalist organizations open their mouth? Nope. Or thousands of Indians dying right now in Saudi Arabia while building this weird wall. Did Hindu national organizations open their mouths? Did the HAF put up another badly written article on their human rights page next to their articles about Hindu repression in Bangladesh, Pakistan and Kashmir? Nope. You see, I say this because I want folks to understand that the leaders of or drivers of these political cults do not really have any consistent ideological backbone. They will say and do whatever they can to attain more power and wealth. A perfect example of this is the recent defense of Elon Musk's Sikh Heil by the ADL. The HAF and other privileged caste groups in the US can say all they want about how they don't, how they are against discrimination and so on and blah blah blah. But at the end of the day, their actions and their wallets suggest that they lobbied against anti-caste bills, and they actively fund the oppression of other Indians back in India by supporting domestic terror groups like the VHP. These groups are mercenaries for hire, the brown shirts basically, for local politicians who are linked to the BJP. I mentioned before that some of these guys hunt down other Indians in the north suspected of eating or selling cows. They plan these vigilante hunts in elaborate ways, organizing teams across highways like bandits, communicating using WhatsApp, India's favorite disinformation channel. These groups are typically led by Brahmins and other privileged caste folks who have direct ties to politicians. Take this most recent case in Faridabad. And by the way, these cases of sectarian violence are depressingly easy to find. They are the talk of every tea stand in India when things like it happen. Your local tea shops are the morning news for a lot of people. In September of 2024, a group of Hindu nationalist cow vigilantes, the Haryana Gau Seva Ayog, received word from one of their lookouts that a suspicious car, a Renault Duster to be precise, was transporting beef. The Hindu nationalists lay in wait on the Delhi-Agra National Highway in a Maruti Suzuki Swift. They gave chase once they spotted the Duster and opened fire. The chase went on for 40 kilometers, after which a bullet hit the shoulder of the person sitting in the passenger seat, causing the driver to slow down and come to a halt. One of the Hindu nationalists got out of the vehicle, walked up to the passenger seat, and pumped a bullet into the passenger's neck to finish the job. The Hindu nationalists got back into the car and fled. Later, it was revealed that the person who was killed was Aryan Mishra, a teenager who had just joined the Gulati family, the other passengers in the car, for dinner. Usually, in many cases like this, both the Indian media and law enforcement tend to love turning the discussion into, oh well, did they actually have beef? And while the country is focusing on that conversation, the vigilantes are often let off the hook. But in this case, it was revealed that, like the other occupants in the car, Aryan Mishra was a Brahmin. When the 4 Hindu nationalists involved in the shooting were apprehended, Anil Kaushik, the shooter, said that he regretted his crime because he had killed a Brahmin, and that he was also a Brahmin. He said that he had only opened fire because he was convinced that the passenger was a Muslim. This is the true face of Hindu nationalism, and this is what that Tesla driving uncle sending money to organizations like the HSS and HAF or VHP or whoever is funding. This is what many young Indians are supporting when they give a pass to Modi and his actions. This is about power, who has it, and who is willing to use it. Just like how Hanuman Kind was willing to change his lyrics and dance for a bunch of uninterested right-wing uncles in the US and hug an actual fascist just to get the bag, many privileged Indians are willing to step on other Indians to keep their places in the social ladder. And of course, this is not just an Indian thing. Under the current failing world order and the reality, the invisible reality that is capitalism and neoliberalism, we are all taught to step on each other's necks to get ahead. We are fed this lie that we are all millionaires in waiting. And we are taught that it's okay to look the other way when your fellow human being is being oppressed. What does caste have to do with whiteness in America? In 1923, a brown man named Bhagat Singh Thind, not to be confused with Bhagat Singh the anarchist, confronted the racial prerequisites of attaining US citizenship. Thind and his lawyer Mannix argued that according to the prevalent racial science of the time, Thind would be considered a full-blooded Indian, a high-caste Hindu, and a member of the constructed mythical Aryan race. Now remember, this was a field of study only created to justify the Europeans' position at the top of the food chain, while dominating the countries they extracted resources from through violence. Instead of reasoning that bloodshed, violence, and skullduggery was the reason for the success It was convenient for them to reason that they were just naturally superior. And it was good, actually, that they were able to bring modernity and civilization to such savage parts of the world, which many still believe today. They had this reasoning because in India, the British leaned into this idea of having some sort of ancient relation to the privileged caste folks as well. This common ancestry of being Aryan, even though this was just pure fantasy. The founders of the Hindutva movement and the predecessors of the modern-day RSS embraced this idea fully and even worked with the British to quash any semblance of any anti-colonial action. The RSS at the time was exclusively made up of privileged caste folks who supported the British, until they found it useful decades later to recruit poor marginalized folks who they could use as a muscle to swell their ranks. The current Prime Minister and the face of Hindu nationalism is a product of that Brahmin-led RSS. The RSS and Hindu nationalists love using identity politics, and the fact that Modi is from an OBC background is often used to direct away from the inherently casteist nature of Hindu nationalism. M.S. Golwalkar, the Sarsang Chalak, the Grand Dragon, the chief of the RSS, and one of the most influential Hindu nationalists wrote, "To keep up the purity of the race and its culture, Germany shocked the world by her purging the country of the Semitic races, the Jews. Race pride at its highest has been manifest here. Germany has shown how well nigh impossible it is for races and cultures having differences going to the root to be assimilated into one united whole. A good lesson for us in Hindustan to learn and profit by." During the 60s and 70s, Golwalkar set his sights beyond the borders of India to spread the Hindutva ideology under the cover of being some sort of cultural organization merely existing to appreciate Indian culture. He ordered one of his RSS lackeys, Mahesh Mehta, to plant the seeds of Hindu nationalism in the United States. And in 1970, the VHP America was born. The American wing of that same domestic terror organization I mentioned earlier, together with the American version of the RSS, the Hindu Swayamsevak Sangh. They set up shakas all across the US and mobilized a lot of privileged caste members. They funded and supported the rise of the BJP in India. In the 80s, when the Ram Janmabhoomi movement was in full swing, the movement that led to the demolition of the Babri Masjid and deaths of thousands of people along the way, the American Sangh offered political, moral, and financial support to the cause. Many even traveled back to India to aid in the overt oppression of minorities. After the Gujarat riots, the pogrom carried out by Modi, which led to the deaths of thousands of Indian Muslims, the American Sangh and its affiliates mobilized to protect Modi's image and cover up talk of it by attacking critics of Hindu nationalism in the West. This effort to preserve privileged caste Hindus' position of power in the story of India mirrors the efforts of white supremacist political parties in the US to preserve their own positions in American hierarchy. When American conservatives construct a moral panic around critical race theory, American Hindu nationalists construct a panic around critical caste theory. America will point the finger at black folks for being inherently criminal, and the American Sangh will join privileged caste Indians in India to do the same to marginalized caste folks. They mirror each other in their objective to dominate minorities and step on women's rights while using scripture. They will deny LGBTQ rights, even though in the case of some Hindu scriptures there is precedence for gender fluidity and a long history of trans existence. In America, you have white supremacist patriarchy. In India, you have Brahminical patriarchy, all to construct and preserve a permanent underclass while the few at the top get richer. You see, many folks lean into the model minority myth because they already believe that just by being born into a social group, you have an inherent capability for good or bad. an inherent biological component that's responsible for success and competence. This is rooted within Brahmanism and the concept of Varna. This permits a cruel and fantastical rationalization that if you were just born a Brahmin, you were born that because of your efforts and hard work in your past life, because you did good in a previous life. And they believe that if you were born as a marginalized caste person, you were born that way because of a punishment for bad deeds done in your past life. How convenient. And according to scripture, the only way for marginalized folks to redeem themselves for crimes they have not committed is by toiling away on the fields and working for the benefit of the Brahmin. It is this hateful assurance that the marginalized will not live to see their liberation. This is how you create a permanent underclass through scripture. Verse 9, passage 334 and 335 of the Manusmriti say, "For the Shudra, the highest duty conducive to his best welfare is to attend upon such Brahmana householders as are learned in the Vedas and famous. If he is pure, attendant upon his superiors, of gentle speech, free from pride and always dependent upon the Brahmana, he attains a higher caste." Manusmriti verse 10:1-3 states that the distinctive duty of the Shudra is to serve the Brahmin. Everything else that he does is fruitless for him. Chapter 12 of the Brahminical text Gautama Dharma Sutra states that if a Shudra listens intentionally to the Vedas, his ears shall be filled with molten tin or lac. If he recites the Vedas, his tongue shall be cut out. If he remembers them, his body shall be split in twain. Manusmriti verse 8:271 says, "If a Shudra mentions the name and caste of any twice-born men with scorn, a burning iron nail 10 inches long shall be thrust into his mouth." This is biological essentialism through and through. This is why many Indian Americans buy into the idea of the model minority myth, because to them it is not a myth. It is because of the belief that yes, people have inherent qualities received at birth, gifts received at birth. Vivek Ramaswamy has ties to the VHPA. He's recently given keynote speeches at their conferences. He also has ties to the HSS, the equivalent of the RSS of India. Is the same with Kashyap Patel, who has openly cheered for the building of the Ram temple in Ayodhya on the remains of the Babri Masjid. By doing so, he has shown his support for the violence against marginalized folks in India. Tulsi Gabbard, who isn't even ethnically South Asian, has not been shy of her work with the RSS either. And this person is going to be your director of intelligence. This is what Hindu nationalism is built on. It is inherently anti-black, and it is built to uphold patriarchal capitalist systems and therefore inherently is anti-progressive. Organizations like the Hindu American Foundation will leave out links between Nazism and the founders of Hindu nationalism. You won't find it on their write-ups whitewashing and airbrushing Hindu nationalism either. This is done to make it more palatable to Americans and the Indian Americans they are trying to recruit. Hindu nationalists will even go so low as to co-opt the victimhood of other histories like the systemic persecution of Jewish folks and shamelessly conflate that with critics of Hindutva. They say that criticism of systems of Brahmanism is just like anti-Semitism. Watch out for these creators who say this, because I can guarantee you they are Hindu nationalists. Another page they've lifted off of Zionist propaganda, weaponizing victimhood while systemically oppressing other minorities directly or indirectly through propaganda. They do this only because they want to appeal to the average American and play the victim. I think these folks forget that they live in America, where one man has literally bought his seat as president. Not to mention, they never make the comparison to South African apartheid, where a white minority subjugated black natives for generations through violence. Which is why Indian American conservatives prefer to use anti-Semitism as a comparison to appeal to liberal American sensibilities and their understanding of shallow victimhood. It is strategic and calculated and must be noted. When Thind made a claim to whiteness in front of the US court in the 20s, he was making a claim to power through lineage and birthright. WEI, its white equity and inclusion, his right to power at the feet of the dominator. During the case, his lawyer laid claim to whiteness by regurgitating popular theories of ancient Aryans dominating indigenous barbarians, as they put it. By doing so, Thind perpetuated anti-blackness and upheld two systems of power, Brahminical and white supremacy. Just like they did during the time of the British Raj, Hindu nationalists will support white supremacist structures and any would-be monarchs at the top of any hierarchy. They will lie through their teeth and change sides strategically to keep their place at the master's feet. And they will willingly hold the whip, because the whip was promised to them at birth. Their masters will point out the targets, and they will use that whip as they have done in the past.
Thank you for everything you've done. Thank you.
Thank you, Vivek.